So today we have Roger Monk with us, and Roger is a Grammy and Juno Award-winning recording and scoring engineer with 50 years of experience in the industry. He was a chief engineer at Little Mountain Sound for 18 years and then went on to open his own Dick and Rogers Sound Studios in 1990 and has been involved in the production of dozens of motion picture scores, countless television movies, and album projects for artists like Bryan Adams, Tragically Hip, AC/DC, Motley Crue, Josh Ramsey, and Michael Buble. Thank you for joining me today, Roger.
It's my pleasure. I'm touched that you would contact me.
Well, this is a fun one because I've known you as long as I can remember.
Indeed. And are you older or younger than Josh?
I'm older than Josh.
You're older than because I distinctly remember Josh being born.
Yeah.
And I remember a session at Little Mountain, whenever heck it was, and I was recording your mom and dad singing vocals, and Josh was sitting on my lap. So I did remind him of that when we were working on one of his projects, and embarrassed, and the rest of the band. But I've known your family a long, long, long time.
Yeah, very, very long time. So do you want to tell us your story briefly for listeners who this might be their first introduction to you, flesh it out a little bit more about your journey in the biz?
Sure. It's interesting one. It has its twists and turns like everybody does. But I started when I was 17 years old, of all things.
Wow.
I worked for CBC in Toronto. And in that era, everything was done on film, celluloid. This is before videotape and before the digital media we have today. And so I got into the music business because of my familiarity with picture. Because whenever anything was done to picture, it had to be off of film. And we were scoring commercials, and we were doing early IMAX projects at the time. So I started freelancing at Eastern Sound in Toronto, and that was the first 24-track studio in the country.
Wow.
It was 1971. Anne Murray, Gordon Lutford, Salome Bay, they all recorded at Eastern Sound. It was quite an interesting place.
Yeah.
And I came out here, was headhunted out here in 1974 and came out. So I sort of sneaked in through my visual medium, although I'd been into music all my life. So that was my way back door into the studio business.
And then you ended up at Little Mountain out here, right?
That's right. And it was an interesting scenario because Jeff and Jeannie Turner had actually built Little Mountain Sound with Griffiths, Gibson, Ramsey, who were big jingle producers and writers at the time.
Yeah.
And literally, we changed positions. I was working for a small studio on Homer Street, and Jeff and Jeannie bought that facility. And literally over a weekend, I went to Little Mountain, and they came to Homer Street.
So is that what became Pinewood?
That's what became Pinewood Studios, exactly right.
Yeah. Just a swap.
Because I'd known Bob Brooks, and Bob Brooks actually was involved in my hiring at the original place on Homer Street.
Yeah.
And he took over management of Little Mountain and then asked me to go over and join him. And so it was a kind of a transition.
Yeah. And then you went on, I mean, you were at Little Mountain for a long time, did a lot of things at Little Mountain. And then you and Dick Abbott opened your own space in, what was that, 1990?
That was in 1990. Yeah, that's correct. Because Little Mountain was going through a transition at the time. It was up for sale, and I don't remember all the details of it, but basically they decided they didn't want to do commercials anymore. They just wanted to specialize in doing rock and roll music. So basically, we were asked to leave, which was very, very strange, and I think they regretted it because Little Mountain was a very interesting place, Sarah, because it had a lot of big rock and roll acts come out of it, but it also had a lot of corporate people coming out of it.
Yeah.
We were doing jingles with Griffiths, Gibson, Ramsey for people all over North America. So we had a lot of suits and clients and big people coming through there, and they would be getting coffee in the morning in the coffee area and rubbing shoulders with the tattoos and the other folks. And it was interesting because most studios either do corporate things or rock and roll things, but we were a happy medium.
Yeah.
And it was a happy medium. It was an interesting place because, you know, the corporate people would come in and go, hey, that's AC/DC. Wow.
Yeah.
So there was an interesting mutual respect and sharing of art forms.
I actually have a very clear memory of when Motley Crue was recording at Little Mountain, and it was like things got really turned upside down because all of a sudden, the building was being graffitied, and there were groupies outside, and it was one of those moments where like, oh, this doesn't actually mesh particularly well with corporate culture.
But we survived for many years. I hate to use the word magical times, but it was a magical time.
You know, everybody that's come out of Little Mountain has said so. Everyone.
You know, and it was an interesting time for not only technology, but in all areas. I was telling someone the other day, I remember us getting a telex machine, which a lot of people won't know what they were, but it was like an electric typewriter that was connected to the phone system. And we were getting telexes like wires from A&M Records and from other record companies. And I don't remember how long it was in the front office, maybe a year or so, but this was prior to having fax machines. And the early fax machines were that wire paper, that waxy paper that they had. And now I look at things and obviously the internet's come along and that's all gone away. In the early days, we were doing rough mixes to cassette, regular audio cassette, and FedExing those to the record companies so they could know what was going on. Nowadays, of course, we just send MP3s and things over the internet. Or they listen in on Zoom or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's a completely different scenario.
Yeah. And along the way, you've really gotten into, correct me if I'm wrong, but my perception is that you've really gotten into specializing in, like, I know through the years you've done all sorts of sound recording. But my perception is that you have a real specialty for like the bigger sort of orchestral scoring kind of recording scenarios.
Well, I've been very blessed having the opportunity to work with those folks. And one of the advantages I had working with Gibson Ramsey was, although we were doing a lot of corporate work, radio and television commercials, as well as audio visuals, there was a big variety of material. It would be maybe country and western one day. Next day it would be maybe middle of the road thing with a string section and some horns and whatever. So this gave me the opportunity to develop my skills and hone my skills because we had to be efficient. We were working with professional musicians. They were coming in, they were putting charts in front of them and they'd play. And we were expected to have it recorded in 10, 15 minutes and on to the next bit. So it was a good opportunity for me to learn the little tricks and be efficient.
Yeah.
Also, because I got the opportunity to work with some fantastic people there. Bob Rock, of course, Mike Fraser. They were the key people in the early days. And I was getting to my later 20s, and they was younger guys, and they were bringing in these interesting bands and developing their own materials. So I was doing more of the corporate things, and they were doing more of the contemporary things. But also because of that, I got the opportunity to inject some of my talents into those records.
Yeah.
When they had orchestral overdubs on the records, I was asked to help out, and there I did. So
that's pretty cool. So here on the Vocal Lab, we sort of aim to shine a light into the industry through the lens of what I know now that I wish I'd known then. So with that in mind, if you were starting your career all over again, are there any things that you would do differently? Any things that stick out that you would definitely do the same?
Oh, that's a very deep question. It's a very tough thing to do because the industry is completely different.
Yeah.
There's not the same amount of music recorded today as there was in the past. Number one. Number two, a lot of it's done electronically as opposed to acoustically.
Yeah.
Because in that time, the vast majority, this is before synthesizers. In fact, one little sidestep here. I remember when I first went to Little Mountain, there was a gentleman there named Ralph Dyke who was working with the early synthesizers, and the back wall of one of the studios at Little Mountain was just wall to wall of gadgets and buttons and knobs and wires and whatnot. And he was actually working with the Roland to develop the early synthesizers. So that was the early days of electronic music. When I started out, everything was acoustically recorded. So it's a different era.
Yeah.
The wisest thing I would say to young people today that want to get into the business is apprenticeship. I still firmly believe in working with a person that you respect, you can learn from, learn those techniques. Studying from a book, going into school and learning the theory is fine and important, but you're not going to come out of a school like that and be given a studio with musicians and a band and a budget to record. It's just not going to happen. So you have to get in and work with somebody that's doing that, see how they do it, maybe exchange some ideas, and that's the only way to learn and to develop those skills.
Yeah. I think that's really important in a lot of different aspects of music, and honestly, pretty much any kind of business that you can get into. That aspect of mentorship and learning in that sense, it gives you, I think, a lot more of the soft skills that go along with whatever is at hand than, like you say, you can learn the ABCs out of a book or in a classroom or whatever, but really learning the nuances comes from experience.
Exactly so. And I have a young gentleman that's working with me now named Andrew Downton, who is also doing some mastering now in town here and getting a name for himself and doing some amazing work. But Andrew has been working with me for about the last 7 years.
Yep.
And he's my right-hand man when we do scoring sessions. Now he knows what I want, and we discuss things ahead of time, of course, but he knows and he thinks ahead of me and makes suggestions to me now, which is good. One little side issue, and I won't mention any names or anything, but we try to reach out to young students and say, hey, we're going to be doing a 65-piece orchestra. Come and see what we're doing. Give us a hand. Set some chairs out if you'd like to. And somebody did. They took us up on that, and we were laying everything out. And I asked the simple question. I said, so what kind of acoustic instruments have you done in the school? Well, we did record a banjo once. And I'm just absolutely floored that the majority of their work had been electronic, and they'd never actually physically set a studio up and had to use microphones the way we were, and it just blew me away.
No kidding, because I mean, yes, lots of stuff is electronic now, but you still, if you're going to record bands ever, you're going to be recording live drums. You are going to be recording live guitars. Maybe the keyboard stuff goes direct in, but those other things are going to be recorded acoustically, and not to mention vocals. So that's a large hole in the training.
I was absolutely blown away, sir. And this person wasn't a novice; they'd been doing it for a while, you know. But anyway, Andrew is certainly working with me now and doing some good stuff himself. Another gentleman who I know you've spoken to, Jeff Zipp.
Yes.
He came and joined me with a session. Same thing. I said, Jeff, we don't have a huge budget for you, but come and help out, and I'm sure you'll learn some stuff. And he did. And he worked with us for 3 or 4 days, and I know he learned a lot. So
Yeah. Well, he was, I just had him on the show last week, actually, and he was talking about, you being one of the people that has been an important learning figure for him. And I think also those relationships, like, you never know, working on your relationship skills, which is part of learning in a mentorship situation, but you never know what else that's going to lead to. Like, for instance, Jeff is now off recording The Amazing Race, and that came through a suggestion to the show from your, I don't know if it was from you directly or from your studio, but that was the pathway that ended up getting him that gig. So my point being, if he'd never come and taken you up on that offer to sit in on that session and do the learning from you, that whole part of his life would never have transpired. So those relationships, I think, are really important, both for the musical skills and the relationship part of it.
Well, life in general, Sarah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that's important. Is roots and people and personalities, and such many good people came out of Little Mountain. We talked about Mike Fraser,
Yeah.
Bob Rock, of course, Ron Vermeulen.
Yeah.
Those are the early days. Pat Glover,
Yeah.
and these are all people that we got along. We were a family. I mean, that's what when you're working together, you almost spend as much time together as you do with your partners.
Yeah.
So those people's skills are important, and particularly if you're working with musicians who come from a variety of backgrounds and whatnot, but they're professionals and they deserve to be treated that way.
Yeah.
Particularly members of the Vancouver Symphony and the opera orchestra and a lot of the jazz players that we've had in sessions. They know what they're doing, and we have to make them feel comfortable, and so because they've got to perform. So the whole thing is coordinating the thing and making it a good experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So jumping off of that, and you're talking about mentorship or apprenticeship and that kind of thing. Um, we work in an industry that all the different aspects of it, whether you're on the playing side or whether you're on the audio side or whatever, widely different levels of education. And some people have learned in, private lessons or a classroom or whatever. And some people it's been very self-taught. And then there's the aspect of mentorship. What was your education in terms of the audio world? What did that look like?
That's such an interesting question because one of the interesting thing is whenever I've been in to watch other people record and do a project, and I look at the way that they're recording something and thought, well, that's interesting. I've never thought about doing that. And I try it myself. Sometimes I've learned and I add that to my skills. And there are other times when I try it and it just doesn't work for me. If there's something about different techniques, and there's not everything is the only way of doing things. So I think you have to keep your mind open about things and look at other techniques and learn from them, but also develop your own skills and find out what really works and what doesn't work. There are obviously some laws of physics that you have to be aware of, but experiment. Try things that might work, and some of them that will, and some of them won't, and you add that to your vocabulary, if you will.
Absolutely. So when you were getting started, did you learn in an official capacity, or did you learn by trial and error and working with people, or how did that start at the outset for you?
I learned by trial and error, to be perfectly honest. I learned my skills initially at Eastern Sound in Toronto, as I mentioned, the first 24-track studio in the country. And I learned by helping other engineers set up and observing and watching what they were doing. And then when I came out here to Vancouver, the same thing. I had my own rock band that I was working with and sort of honed my skills offline, if you will, sort of unofficially. And then when I went over to Little Mountain, as I said to you, the opportunities of working with so many different kinds of music with Griffiths Gibson was just a godsend to me. Literally, and this is the other thing that you need to know. Literally, I was in the studio every day, Monday to Friday, 8 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night, 52 weeks a year, year in, year out. Not many engineers ever get that opportunity today.
Yeah.
And we had to be efficient, and we had to perform, and we had to do it. There was no waffling. There were no demo. Well, we did do demos, but even the demos had to be good.
Yeah.
Because we were selling somebody an idea and a solution to their problem. So we even had to do good demos. But it was an opportunity to work with choirs, big bands, country and western, string quartets, you name it. It was just a huge variety.
Mm-hmm.
And in the evenings, a lot of the time, I was doing a lot of records with Bob Brooks.
Mm-hmm.
We had school bands coming in. We had church choirs. We had all sorts of artists come through. And it was a great opportunity to hone my skills.
Yeah.
And at the same time, pass some of those techniques off onto other folks who
Mm-hmm.
are now, most of them are still in the business.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same with the team that I have working with me here. We don't do a lot of music. We're doing a lot of sound.
Yeah.
So a lot of the rules around sound and recording and manipulation, particularly now with computers, whether you're recording bands or whether you're recording sound effects, it's basically all the same thing.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that distinction? Because I think not everybody understands the difference between recording music and recording sound, and what that really means.
Well, I have the team that are working with me. I've been very fortunate. I've got guys who've been with me for 30 years, and a few have been 15 or 10 years. Now Andrew's been with me for about 8.
Yeah.
We all basically came to the business because we like music
Mm-hmm.
and because we wanted to record music. Again, because there's not the opportunities that there were years ago to certainly make a full-time living doing that.
Yeah.
So they have found ways in working with doing sound for, in our case, animation, recording dialogue for shows, recording Foley,
Mm-hmm.
using editing and pulling sound effects out of sound effect libraries. Now it's all online, of course. In the old days, it used to be on CDs and records even before
Mm-hmm.
that. And using that and electronically being concerned with equalization and balance and reverb and dimension. And, today we've got the different requirements like mixing in Atmos, which is a whole different environment. I remember being at Little Mountain, boy, it must have been the early 80s when they started talking about mixing in quad,
Mm.
left, right, front, and left, right, rear. And we actually put that system into Little Mountain, and a lot of the early consoles, the SSLs, were designed around mixing
Mm-hmm.
in quad. But it was never really a medium that took off.
Yeah.
I don't really remember it doing too much. Nowadays, of course, we're mixing in 5.1 and other formats. And
Mm-hmm.
even for music, a lot of videos are done in surround, so that
Yeah.
you can wrap the audience around the music. You can
Yeah.
put them either sitting in the audience or in the middle of the band. And they're working with techniques where you actually turn your head now and the band stays here, but you can actually spatially look around the room. And
Oh
there's all those
wow.
techniques being developed. So
Wow. It's kind of mind blowing, honestly. Um, and you're talking about like a lot of the SSLs were built for mixing it in quad, I think is what you said, right? So in the course of your job, I know that you have your own studios, but you don't only ever just work in your own studios. I know, for instance, on my brother's project, like you went and you guys worked in the warehouse when you were recording the orchestral stuff for his record. And so things like that. For young people coming in, is there a learning curve that sits around different boards and different consoles and having to be able to jump from one to another?
that's certainly a challenge, Sarah. Yes. I mean, the warehouse is probably one of the best maintained studios
Mhm.
in the country. The desk we were using for your brother's project was a Rupert Neve, a big Rupert Neve,
Mhm.
and it was designed in the 70s and 80s. It has an amazingly good sound. It has that analog sound that we all go for.
Yeah.
Uh, Operationally, that's the kind of desk that I grew up with.
Yeah.
So I fully understand it. The same thing with solid state logic, which I think we bought the first SSL in Little Mountain, I think in the middle to late 70s.
Yeah.
And then we put the second one in, and that developed. And that became kind of took over from Neve in many ways, particularly in the rock and contemporary studios. And they're still seen and basically once you know how to use those, basically they're very similar. The desks are different because of different sizes, but the actual signal flow and the routing are very, very similar. Today, there's a lot of digital consoles. Personally, I don't like the sound of them like the old analog days. My ears are still locked in the analog days, and I use a lot of outboard gear that injects that sound and those dynamics into the recording package and the recording chain. And a lot of the desks that are made today are designed to interface with Pro Tools.
Yeah.
So that you're actually basically recording straight into Pro Tools, and that's coming back through another mix, through a monitoring medium. And they don't build desks like they used to, where you had inputs and monitors and outputs and channels for headphones and different monitor feeds. But a big session like a film score, you either have to have a desk that's got that kind of monitoring ability, or you're basically trying to record it simultaneously. So it's basically live to disc, if you will.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's an important thing too, because when you're recording an orchestra, basically that's the finished product. You're not going to be doing a lot of overdubs.
Yeah.
You may put some percussion on, or there may be a vocal choir or something added later. But basically, the orchestra is the orchestra, and you have to kind of treat it like an instrument.
Yeah,
it's a multitude of people playing, a lot of different sounds coming in, but the results are one thing.
Yeah.
So I put that for people to think about. So
yeah, absolutely. So this question, to be clear, you can answer it however you want to, but I'm not asking you specifically to name names. That's not where I'm going. Just in a more general sense, though, what have been the most important relationships in the course of your career that have helped you to get where you are?
I think reputation, interesting relationships. Well, the team I work with now, the majority of the recording I do is orchestral based and big band based, like Michael Buble. So the main people I work with these days are Hal Beckett and Vince Renault. Hal is it's a conductor and a composer in his own right. He writes a lot of scores for motion pictures and television shows.
He's got the Vancouver Film Orchestra, right?
He heads up the Vancouver Film Orchestra, yes. And Vince and I basically facilitate getting recordings done. So sometimes a producer or a composer will come to us and say, we want to record in Vancouver. This is the kind of band we want to do. And we help make it happen for them. So those relationships are important because it's reliability. You have to know when you hire a musician or an engineer or a composer or an arranger or a conductor, that they know what they're doing. Because the ramifications of working with that many musicians are horrendous. It's an expensive thing.
Yeah.
So you have to know that you're going to get the result.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the key thing. And it's the same thing when I work with Bob and Michael Buble doing his album. I mean, boy, I've known Bob Rock since 1975, for heaven's sake. And he asked me to help him with the album, and I was obviously very touched to do that. But he knew what he was getting.
Yeah.
And again, it's important. This is Michael Buble, and in that particular case, we recorded it in Los Angeles. So you're working with an important artist with a budget and a big record company and musicians coming into an expensive studio, and you have to give results.
Yeah, you have to
There's no
deliver.
fooling around. You have to do it.
Yeah.
And that you can't really experiment. You have to set up and do it the way you know is going to work. And sometimes, if we want to try out a new microphone or a new technique, we'll do that. But we'll use the old techniques as well. So you can, that works. That sounds good. Nope, let's dump that. Let's go back to this.
Right.
So that you don't waste time, because it's expensive time.
So, I mean, that kind of brings us to talking a bit about your studio process. Do you want to talk? So, for people who don't understand what you do, I mean, my audience is not necessarily a well-seasoned audience. They're more younger and emerging artists, and who need to have a better picture of what people's roles are and what they do. Can you talk a bit about your studio process, right from the prep work through the setup to the actual session? What does it really look like?
Well, obviously, you need to get all the information
Yeah.
ahead of time of what you're expected to do, what the recording is, what musicians are involved, where we're going to record it, how it's going to be used, and ultimately, you need to know from beginning to end what's going to happen so you
Yeah.
can plan it accordingly. In my case, I need to make sure that I've got a team of people behind me that I can rely on because there's a lot going on. And it's a team effort. It's not just me. I may be responsible, but there's a whole team of people working with me and people relying on me, and I have to give results, as I said. So we have to plan things out. We plan how we're going to set the studio up. If in the case of a big band, for instance sake, so you've got a rhythm section and you've got trumpets, you've got trombones, you've got saxophones. What kind of percussion have they got? Are we going to do any overdubs afterwards? Are we going to do it all at once? So all this has to be thought of and planned out. So we set days ahead of time. We plan ahead how we're going to set the studio up, what microphones we're going to use, which channels they're going to get plugged into, setting up the headphones, monitor mixing, whether there's click tracks to keep the tempo or whether it's completely off the floor. All of those things are important, and it has to be planned out so that we can work efficiently. We then go into the studio, obviously depending on the size of the session, but many hours before the first musicians arrive. So we can physically set the room up, keeping in mind sight lines so that we know that musicians are going to be able to see the conductor, see each other. If there's any monitor video feeds to take into account so everybody can see frames, frame counters, all of those kind of things. And we set it all up and we test it.
Yeah.
And we retest it. And we make sure that there's no hums, there's no buzzes. All the headphones work, both sides, although generally we only use one side to feed the musicians. But we have to make sure that everything works so that when people start to come in to the room, that's actually the start when I start getting sounds. When I hear musicians walking in, I actually use them tuning up and settling down and chatting to each other to make sure that my panning is the way I want to set it up.
Yeah.
So that at the time the downbeat's supposed to happen and they start taking an A, it's 95% there.
Yeah.
So that then we can actually start recording right away.
Yeah, that's I imagine that's actually a tricky juggle.
There's a lot of pressure, and that's the first 10 minutes are the most anxious from my perspective. Although we've done all the tests, there's always something come up.
Yeah.
A musician's going to be late, or they added an extra trombone that we weren't planning on. So you have to be ready so that you can handle any kind of little emergency that might come up.
Yeah.
Oh, and you've got some spare microphones and you've got some spare channels to use so that you can quickly do a changeover if you need to.
Yeah.
It's efficiency. And with contemporary music, it's not quite the pressure, but you still have to be ready to go and you still have to be tested.
Yeah.
So you don't look like an idiot. So you look like you know what you're doing.
Thanks for listening. That was actually just the first half of my interview with Roger. So come on back on Thursday so you can hear all the rest. We can't wait.